Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the book The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, I'm speaking with William Redd. He's a lawyer and Shroud speaker and Shroud researcher, and he's got some interesting perspectives using kind of a legal side of things as it relates to some of the unfortunate findings of the radiocarbon dating and otherwise. So definitely looking forward to hearing from them, hearing from Will on that. So Will, tell us about your backstory on the Shroud of Turin and how you got involved in it.
Well, first, it's a long journey. I'm ex-Navy, so I've got electronics qualifications, so I'm interested in technical things. But I'd prayed one day, God, can you use my qualifications? And then out of the blue, I'm at a pedestrian crossing, and this old guy, well, about my age, starts talking to me just for less than a minute about the Shroud of Turin. And I thought, that's interesting. So I was thinking it in terms of lawyers, because I'd just written a booklet called Science Proves God. I'll show you that one. And that based the evidence on how lawyers think, on juridical science and statistical science. So I began looking at various podcasts, YouTubes, and I saw Barry Schwartz and Teddy Pappas and Joe Marino. And my mind's saying, why haven't you said this? Why haven't you put a level of proof there? And then I got really deep into it and I said, well, nobody else is thinking about how law can bring the common sense, reasonable outcome. And law, as everyone knows, is very meticulous when it comes to forensic science. And we've got a whole collection of science when associated with the Shroud. So one of the things with law is you've got a sorting out technique. What's good evidence? What's bad evidence? How reliable is the evidence? And we've got definitions of reasonableness. Nobody ever thinks about that. They'll use the word. And so I thought we need to get this out there. And some of the things, for instance, we use the term beyond reasonable doubt. People just throw it away, but they don't really know what even reasonable is in the court of law. It's very forensic. When people use statistics and maths, everyone says, oh yeah, but we put those mathematics into words and we use levels of proof. There are actually 3 levels of proof here. You've got a reasonable suspicion. So that means the police can investigate, but also is on what basis can you form a hypothesis, I guess, in science. So that's the beginning. You've got a reasonable suspicion. Also got on the balance of probabilities. There's a 51% chance this is correct. And that's not much of a chance, 1% more than 50. But on that basis alone, you can get hundreds of millions of dollars payout. So it is very, very serious. And then we come to beyond reasonable doubt. Now, this is one we use and make sure that an innocent person doesn't go to jail. And that equates to what the carbon-14 daters said. This is 95% reliable, far, far more reliable than on the balance of probabilities. And so I began thinking about this and I said, well, we need to communicate what reasonableness is out there, how us lawyers use it. And there's been some funny reactions to that. They're saying, oh, that's not science, because I've recently been on a blog. It's not science, that's inappropriate science. When in fact, this is the science that will test a whole collection of evidence and documents to forensic evidence, to DNA and all those kinds of things. So we have formula in law. For instance, we talk about the reasonableness in beyond reasonable doubt. So we've got a thing called the Wednesbury principle. For instance, something is so unreasonable that no reasonable person would come to that conclusion. And we're going to find out that we've had that kind of thing all the way here in the evidence. Another one that we use in Australia, the case of Comcare and you, where something is unreasonable if it's absurd or illogical. And then we try and find out what a fair-minded observer, who's got a firm mind, not nutty, who knows all the facts, what that decision is. So we don't just flippantly use the word reasonable anymore. So I'm looking at the Shroud sciences and the comments, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, here we've got some very absurd rulings. Well, sorry for the legal analysis. So one of the things I looked at was Barry Schwartz, who went in and said, this is a painting. But then when he looked at it, he said, this image isn't painted. And all the other methods, he said, there's no painting. So we've refuted that idea. But then along comes someone who says, oh, Leonardo da Vinci painted it. So using the test in law, that's Leonardo da Vinci idea is unreasonable because it's absurd. We looked with microscopes, photographic science, all kinds of methods, and there ain't any paint there. So we got to get rid of some of this stuff that they're saying is, oh, this is what it is. And you need to do that in court of law to be fair to people. You don't keep cluttering it with every kind of thing that a mind can come up with. And so when you place that here, the Shroud science into that category, taking a good forensic look at all the science that's there, you can throw away a lot of the stuff that's being said. And to demonstrate how important it is that legal science is applied to the Shroud evidence, very timely, we have a forensic scientist in Colorado in the USA who looks like she might be getting in trouble for not doing it properly. The coincidence is in the same state that Barry Schwartz lived, we now have a forensic scientist who's been investigated by the police for very sloppy work. So we don't know the outcome of it. I'm not saying she's guilty, but that shows the real necessity to get things right, especially if you're talking beyond reasonable doubt. And once again, in Queensland, Australia, we have somebody that's been suspended, that's the boss of a DNA organisation. And I'm giving those examples to emphasise how important it is to get the protocols right. And I remember looking at the early podcasts of Shrouders, and they're talking about all these protocols weren't followed. Well, hold on. You could go to jail. We might have someone going to jail in Colorado for not following protocols. But they were so dismissive when they did the carbon-14 dating test. And then I read Joe Marino's book, and my first reaction was, wow, because here we've got it fully documented of all the protocols that were breached, and some so serious, you're wondering why we're using the carbon-14 dating to say beyond reasonable doubt that it's the answer. And when you look at the p-value test, because they didn't use the term beyond reasonable doubt, they used the term 95% reliable. So if you look on Wikipedia, the p-value test, it says in there 95% is significant, the other 5% of evidence is useless, it's irrelevant. And I'm thinking, you need an exceptionally high, meticulous obedience to the protocols for that. So I said, well, something pretty wrong here with this carbon-14 dating, isn't it? So to have that many protocols broken, to be dismissive of all the other evidence, you wouldn't do that in a court of law. We do have a method here in many countries where if we're going to court, we have a pre-trial session where we have a look at all the evidence to see if it's relevant, it's important, it's no good. And once I've looked at the C14 dating, I believe it would not be admitted in court. It was that flawed. But here we've got so many people relying on it. And I'm saying that's not right. And I guess most of it is because most people don't know the test for reasonableness that a lawyer or a court of law would use. So, but you should have been able to get all the leaders, the scientists to say, okay, what's reasonable? And so as I look at the carbon-14 dating, the very first thing, before they even got to look at the shroud, they were told don't smoke because it'll affect the data. And what was unusual was the carbon-14 dating dismissed the fact that the shroud had been through 2 fires, had been burnt, so much smoke on it, but you can't smoke around it. They've said, on the one hand, cigarette smoke will affect it, and let's ignore the smoke in those fires. We don't even know what chemicals were being burnt in those fires to make the data wrong. So in terms of unreasonableness, straight away, we can say carbon-14 dating is the wrong test for many reasons. We don't know how much all this fire smoke settled. We don't know if one area has a bigger patch of being smoked and another one hasn't got any smoke. We can't tell that. And on that basis alone, you've got to say this is inadmissible evidence, because imagine the consequences is that you're using evidence to put someone in jail for the rest of their life. You can't just be dismissive. So straight away, the carbon-14 dating is unreliable and inadmissible in court. So I'm thinking to myself, let's get this message across. We don't just dismiss everything as significant. And then they took one sample. Now, the principle of that sample is stating the whole of the cloth is exactly the same as this one sample. Well, we know straight away through the smoking, well, that can't be right. And then we looked at this sample. Finally, we find out that there's a gradient in there, an anomaly, some people call it, and I call it a pattern. So from one end of that tiny little sample, there's 130 years difference to the other. So by calculations, that pattern, and this is what the carbon-14 datas are saying, that pattern goes through the whole of that shroud. They have to say that because they connected the date to the whole of the shroud. So if you follow that pattern through, one end of the shroud is 16,000 years different from the other. So when they're saying their dates in the Middle Ages is 95% reliable, you've got to say plus or minus 16,000 years. This, as we go back to our principles in ComCare and you, it says something is unreasonable if it's absurd or illogical. Now, if they said this sample is 95% reliable for the sample, we might be a little bit more in favour of them, but they haven't. And that's a very worrying thing. Why on earth would they say it's 95% reliable? And they had the opportunity to take 7 samples from all around that shroud And that could give you a much more reasonable outcome. So when I first heard about that, I thought, hold on, how can you get reliable? How can you be reasonable when you've got one that's supposed to fit the whole shroud? So that, once again, the single sample method is too unreasonable. I mean, it's done, sampling is done throughout the world, throughout sciences. If you want to investigate human being psychology around the world, you need between 120,000 and 210,000 samples in data. If you want to check out an area for mining it to see if there's gold in there, you just don't pick up a nugget and say the whole of this place is full of gold. You need to get the samples. So when they decided not to take the 7 samples, the decision had to be so unreasonable to say it's beyond reasonable doubt. This was absurd. It's illogical. I don't know what the real reason was for not having the 7 samples. But in the science of law, this is unacceptable. So to answer the question of the dates, we can't use a single sample at all and say it's beyond reasonable doubt. It could move forwards. And then we hear about Ray Rogers coming up and finding that there's a 2,000-year-old piece of thread and a Middle Ages thread. And I'm looking at that and I'm asking myself, well, they didn't know that at the time of the carbon-14 dating. Otherwise, they would have raised it. And we now don't know how diluted that sample is. Was it 50% 2000? I mean, in my mind, just for an example, if you mix a 20th century thread with a first century thread, are you going to get a 12th century outcome? How much thread do you need? What was it, 50-50? Was it just one piece of thread? We don't know. And therefore, once again, it's unreasonable to make a date from the carbon-14 dating.
Well, and to your point about the fair-minded person, a fair-minded person would see that as potentially just that. I mean, there's so many other things, so many of the flaws in the carbon dating, but just those two things alone, should be seen by a fair-minded person that understands something about sampling and techniques and the technical side of statistics. They should at least be able to say, no, that just doesn't sound right. And to your point, are you, as a jurist, are you actually going to convict somebody and put somebody to death based on that evidence? And that would be very hard.
That's exactly right. And that's why this juridical science is a very good way of analysing what's right. And so when you put on one side the evidence for a middle age date and on the other side the evidence for a non-middle age date, you've got to look at the carbon-14 dating. And if you're putting that into a court for discussion, one of the things that they use in getting rid of evidence, saying it's not admissible, is because it would be unfair to jurors to have to deal with something that is so unreliable that they'd be confused. And I think I've given a link for you to put down there, which discusses evidence and how it's given different weights. And I think we use the term weight in law because I may go back centuries to when they've decided to put a figure with a blindfold holding some scales. So it puts evidence on both sides. And because we've removed the carbon-14 dating under the principles we use in law, all of a sudden the scale drops the other way. You've got Bishop Darkis's their discussion about forgery. And what I say to that, well, there was an original and there was a forged painting perhaps, and that might be why we get a few dots of vermilion on it. A painter's gone very close to have a look and he's flicked some stuff on it. But we've got the original because There's no paint on the image. We've dismissed that beyond reasonable doubt. So Bishop Darkus's evidence, in that link that I've given you, it says some of this stuff, secondary documents, are given less weight. They're less reliable. So for the bishop to say, oh, there's a forgery, this is a forgery, well, hold on a second. It's not talking about we caught the forger in the act. He's just saying it's this. So that weight of what Bishop Darkus was saying is not very strong at all. And we even go, it's so close that it may be hearsay, which means, oh, someone told me this, that, and the other. And when you're going into a criminal case beyond reasonable doubt, we dismiss hearsay straight away. We don't need that in there. There are some very minor exceptions where you can get that. So there might be a confession that someone's made just before they died, and you've listened to it, that kind of stuff. But they give, there's a reasonable suspicion there's a forgery, but once we've investigated it and found out, no, this isn't the one that was painted, this isn't the one, we've actually got the original in this Shroud document we've got here. So when you now find that the weight for a middle-aged state is gone, you look at the other side of the evidence, and the newest technology, non-destructive, wide-angle X-ray, says it's 2,000 years old. And that refutes those people who want to say, oh, no, it's Middle Ages, because they've got no weighty evidence. They've not got any strong evidence at all. And then we add to that the thing about extinct pollen from the 4th century. There's pollen on it from way before the Middle Ages. And then we go to the Jerusalem dust. It ain't there. And then we look at the head covering. We've got it documented back to the 3rd or 4th century. And the correlation between the blood stains on that head covering and on the shroud itself, this is very strong evidence. Apparently there are more aligning places on that headcloth and the shroud than they are in fingerprinting. I believe it's about fingerprinting's around 16 alignments, and we've got around 50 plus alignments in the shroud. So everything's pointing to the earlier date. So when you compare the evidence of the carbon-14 dating, which will be thrown out on unreliability grounds, because what we're finding out with the current DNA cases coming along, the evidence has to be that strong, reliable, and we don't have that in carbon-14 dating. We have some very odd occurrences. If you look through Joe Marino's records, I won't go into them, but they're very unusual in how the carbon-14 daters are looking at things. I mean, they had available the STERP team's results and sciences, and where they took the sample from, I think I was discussing this in emails with Barry Schwartz, was in a very distinctively dark area on the shroud, when they could have come back and said, what's the major colour of this shroud? We'll get it from that area. But they've taken it from an area that is not quite the same as the majority of it. So that's reducing the reliability again. It's absurd to say, oh, this is what the whole shroud is made of, that area, when you know, when you should have seen that, it's darker than the rest. But they stonewalled the steam team. So when you're applying the test of reasonableness, we're saying this carbon-14 dating test is not going to be admitted to give a conviction for anyone. And so this is how juridical science gets to the core of the matter. Yeah.
Well, how do you bring that across though to a juror, and who is not necessarily educated, let's say, in all of these different sciences, and you have on one side of the scale you've got this carbon-14 dating. You've got then potentially, and I've got some arguments for against the Bishop Darcy's memorandum. You've got those two things. And then on the other side, you've got, and let's leave aside for the moment the wide angle X-ray scattering, the wax-S. But you've got the pollen, that you talked about. You've got the alignment of the dates with the headcloth, the sudarium. You've got the Jerusalem soil. You've got the blood serum that, there's a whole bunch of different things. The blood serum that's around the halo around all of the blood stains. You've got, the Ray Rogers threads potentially. You've got the 3D qualities of the image. You've got the black and white, negative, positive kind of equalities. How, though, do you bring those pieces to a juror that is trying to be independent? Because they know there's a I have to make a ruling on somebody, beyond reasonable doubt that this man is going to be convicted to a death sentence. And so, how do you bring those? How do you bring those across?
Well, as I've been trying to do through this podcast, defining what's reasonable to them, we have a sorting out process in the jury. For instance, before it's put together, some people will be honest and say they're biased. We might have someone that's demented that comes along, and both the lawyers agree and say, no, you can't be here. So we'll sort all of that mess out. But here in juridical science, in the science of the shroud, we have got a great discussion going here. And what we need to do is blot out the stuff that's unreasonable. No more talking about Leonardo da Vinci. Don't need that. That's if you want to go to Disneyland and make up a cartoon, well, that's Leonardo da Vinci. That's so poor when we've proven beyond reasonable doubt it wasn't painted. So we sought that evidence, and what have you got left? Because why I'm particularly focused on carbon-14 dating is you talk to the jurors about that, and you say, would you do it that way? Does it make sense to you that smoke from a cigarette's not allowed, and but smoke the whole shroud? Oh, don't ignore that. This is a common sense thing, a reasonableness. So very few people would say that's reasonable to say, oh, we ignore the smoke on the shroud. So we wouldn't even get that into court, but let's say it did. Let's say we didn't have this sorting out period, but it makes common sense. So are you going to hang someone because you ignore the smoke on the shroud, that kind of thing? Well, I don't think there's many people who'd let that through, because they'll put themselves in that position and say, hold on, if it was me, I wouldn't want that to come through. They need something better. And then to find out, basically being told this one little thing proves all the other science wrong, common sense. And this is what we're taught, why we've got rules in reasonableness. We define it and say, here it is, think this way. Because I can remember doing the criminal law subject decades ago. Well, I'm lucky I can remember it. But all of a sudden, out of the blue, we talk about the reasonable person test. And I said, wow, to myself, here it is. This is a thing that we call discernment. This is a way that I can figure out throughout life. What's it mean? Most of us just use the word and say, oh, that's unreasonable, or it's reasonable. But no, let's think in terms of not what I think, but think in terms of what really comprises a reasonable thought in a reasonable way. Am I coming up with a conclusion that everyone else would think is unreasonable? And it makes a big difference in the personal life. It gives an element called discernment. And I think everyone wants that. They don't want to be reckless. They want to say, I need to figure this out. And that's part of this podcast here, to say you want to look at the evidence. Don't pick it like you're picking your favourite football team. I mean, that's one thing, because there are no real consequences for picking a favourite football team. And whereas there is in a court of law, you're putting somebody to death, as you put it, the most serious. You can't have that because I wouldn't want it applying to me. And this actually worked during a persecution period for Christians when so many were killed. One section of the community got out of the death penalty for it because they basically argued to the judge, what if it was you in my position? Will they do it to you too? And the judges that registered, I better do the right thing. So here we are.
Well, that is an awesome argument. I could just see, I've been on the jury. I was a juror a couple of times, and you're right. Put yourself into, would you want to have that as your judge and your reasoning to put you to death on something, and all of a sudden, then that definitely changes the way that I would consider that these different presented evidences.
Yeah, it makes a difference. We don't want to wreck the system to put ourselves in trouble. We want to say, hold on, if it comes to me, I want this. And so then we're doing that now with the Shroud. We don't have
Now,
yeah.
yeah, no, I was going to say now I really like your argumentation and the juridical kind of process and how you would look at the carbon 14. I did want to bring up something, a couple of things related to the Darcy's, and I'm going to call it the Darcy's memorandum. And so I was just at the Shroud conference here in St. Louis about 2 weeks ago, and there was a presenter on that presented strictly on the Darcy's memorandum. And what that is for the listeners, what the Darcy's memorandum is that in the, I guess it was the 14th century, this Bishop Darcy's of Troyes, he was writing a memo and writing a letter to the Pope, and he wanted to say that the shroud that was being presented and exhibited in Lire, France, is a forgery, and I know who the forger is. And so that's one thing. Now, the other thing that came out of the conference was that memorandum ever sent? And there's some interesting elements of that. Now, the actual memorandum that was written by Darcys or by a scribe is actually, you can find it in the French National Archives. And so then the presenter that was presenting on it, he actually looked at it and saw it and actually, saw the details of it. And there's two things about that are missing on it. And that's why it's called a memorandum and not a letter. The first thing that you have to have a letter is it has to be dated and it has to be signed. And neither of those two facts are present on that memorandum that's in the French National Archive. And so then the result of that is that it's most likely never been sent. It was most likely written, but never actually sent, because if you were going to send it, especially to the Pope, you got to put the date on it. That's critically important. And you have to sign it. You're not going to send a note to the Pope without your signature on it. The second thing, or the third thing that's interesting, is that there is no proof, at least yet found, there is no proof that there's a copy of that letter in the Vatican archives. If a letter was sent, you typically keep a copy, and you send the original, and so you have two pieces. You have one that would be in the Vatican archives and one that would now be in the French National Archives. Well, the only one that can be found is the one in the French National Archives. So most likely the letter was never sent, and which also then kind of says that the proof or that use of an evidence can also be dismissed. Similar to how the carbon 14 dating was done, now you can kind of dismiss the validity or the value of that in your argumentation that this is a medieval cloth based on a forgery, and here's this letter that proves it. You can't use that for the reasons that I mentioned.
I'm trying to put my legal mind to it, and in the link it says that describes how evidence is sorted and the weight of evidence. The bishop's letter or memorandum hasn't even gone past the reasonable suspicion level. So then it wouldn't be put into the court to prove beyond reasonable doubt. Here, the bishop has said there's a forgery out there. Even if it's in a memorandum, that says something. But what sort of evidence have you got? We don't even know if he was talking about the Shroud of Turin we've got or someone actually painted one. It's just too vague. So, and as you say, you don't have the corroborative evidence, the supporting evidence of the letter. But that's not too big a hurdle, but it's in the discussion, but it's nowhere near even on the balance of probabilities. You've got it down as, okay, there's a suspicion, but we can't go any further with it. So it carries no weight. And then when you add the contra argument of the pollen being extinct in the 4th, 5th century, hello, this ain't that forged one. How do you get that there? And again, he's not talking about the forged one. He's not talking about the real shroud. He's talking about there's a possibility of a forgery out there. Well, all the other evidence we've got overwhelms that to say, no, this ain't that forgery that the bishop were talking about. So we're left with a very vague argument. We know that happens. I mean, imagine if all the evidence for the shroud disappeared except for the Leonardo da Vinci painting one, and for some reason we got no contra evidence. Everyone will start believing that. But we don't. We have a wonderful pile of evidence. I mean, 120 different sciences. We had a wonderful team of STERP scientists, 17, all pointing out the basics. No, it's not a painting. It's not a forgery, because they didn't even know how to make those that image on there. So it can't be 14th century. So the bishop's talking about something else, if at very best. He's talking that somebody made a replica of the shroud. And there is a little bit of evidence for that because we're finding forged relics. We can't deny that. They're making it up. Well, one day maybe we'll find this forgery, but it isn't the shroud, because part of the test was this painted then?
Yeah.
And we've obliterated that. It's inadmissible in court. And it needs to be retracted if you're a scientist. It needs to come out of the equation. They need to say, hello, what have we been doing by endorsing that? We have some suspicions because they wouldn't release all the data for the carbon-14 dating. And then even the data, we've got all kinds of reasons to say it was unreliable because they've got so many missing elements. So this carbon-14 dating, the biggest problems, they didn't get 7 samples, so therefore it's inadmissible. They didn't give the full data. I mean, this equates very much with the current things with these forensic scientists that are in trouble being investigated. We didn't put it all in there. So we can't use the carbon-14 dating at all. It's just out of this, so unreasonable. Let's keep using those words. It's absurd to say that's it. So no, the case is too strong against it. So what have we got left? All the older stuff that says it's way, way back. And so to put a verdict into place, it's beyond reasonable doubt that this shroud that we've got belongs to the time of Christ, 2,000 years of age. It's not. And that's one of the things I'd like for shrouders to enter into discussions. For instance, very early on, the carbon dating data said this is 95% reliable. We've now found it isn't. I'd like to see those that are pro-shrouders saying our evidence is beyond reasonable doubt. And when we understand the terms reasonable and how it's used in law, well, then it makes complete sense that we've got the shroud. You can talk in human terms. What would humans do? And I think Barry Schwartz commented once about his mum who said, oh, no doubt it's absolutely genuine. And Barry said, why? And she said, well, they wouldn't have taken it with all the floods and all that on there, because that'd be very, very serious consequences. Of course it is. And this is in the world of common sense, what do humans normally do
Mm.
in that kind of things. And if it's abnormal, well, you need strong evidence. I mean, all the healing miracles of Jesus, they had so many witnesses to these things, and we're getting crowds of thousands because of the very miracles that he's doing. And so we have the witnesses. It's not some obscure thing that maybe it's just one person.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so let me push just yeah. So for each of the evidences, so we've got we have the wax cess, the most recent one. And then you have the pollen, the extinct pollen. You have the Jerusalem dust on the feet and the nose and the knees. And uh, what is the process to allow those in as evidence, as opposed to now we've talked about how to exclude evidence, but what is the process now to allow them in to say yes, beyond reasonable doubt? We trust the scientists that have found these extinct pollen on the cloth. We trust the scientists. How do you now positively allow those in?
Yeah, well, for the same reason they began with the carbon-14 dating, it's relevant. Well, we've proved carbon-14 dating is irrelevant. We have a question, is this a middle-aged date? So it's no dispute that the pollen there is of a date that's many, many years earlier than that, 1,000 years earlier. So here's the relevance. It says that pollen could not have reasonably got on there unless it was at the time 1,000 years earlier than the Middle Ages. So if you read the link, it talks about relevance of evidence. And then the fabrication, because it doesn't make much sense except for that the cloth was in Jerusalem itself, the fabrication that it was painted somewhere in France or there, when we've got Jerusalem dust on it. It's absurd to say, maintain, oh, this is in France, it wasn't anything to do with Jerusalem, and there it answers the question. No, it's in Jerusalem. The relevance is the location of the dust fits in with the history that you find in the Gospels that Jesus fell down. And though it wasn't all over, like the smoking, the patches are in the right places. So that's the relevance. This is corroborative evidence, not fully 100%, 100% beyond reasonable doubt, but it's because it's corroborative of the earlier dates, it's acceptable. How does it get there? What reasonable way would have it appeared there? So we've got this fanciful idea that a forger put it all there to such a detail, it doesn't make sense.
Mm.
So we ask the question in the Comcare and U case, it says, is that absurd to say a forger would have done all that? Of course. So what's the most reasonable way that this came about? So it's illogical too to think that a forger would go to that extent and even then not
Well, then have
explain
the
it on.
knowledge and have the
Yeah,
knowledge to know to go to that extent.
yeah,
And then then you have all of the how would he have known how what happens when you crucify someone and how the blood flows are. I mean, there's so many different pieces and of just evidence that's on there that a forger just absolutely could not make up. You would have to have a prototype that you could look at to say, okay, well now I can maybe copy it. But even then, how do you get the blood on there first and the image second? How do you get the serum halos on there if you've never known about them? You never even heard about them. How do you get the dust on there? How do you get the pollen on there? And I mean, there's just so many little things that after a while, the absurdity becomes absurd in and of itself.
yeah. And this is where we talk in legal terms about the preponderance of evidence. How much is there? How did you connect all the dots? And we've got that many that you've just listed through and more. The only way they can all be connected together, beyond reasonable doubt, is if there was a 2,000-year date and that this was Jesus, the crucified guy. All this other stuff, it doesn't make sense. That's why, since we've got rid of the carbon-14 dating as a reliable, there's really no contra evidence. The sheer quantity of the pile of evidence, you can only come up with one reasonable answer. And that is so much that it's beyond a reasonable doubt that the shroud and the person on the shroud was Jesus of Nazareth. And we're now even getting better science. We've got Bob Rucker. He's trying to explain the differences there instead of just having the invisible weaving theory of Ray Rogers. Perhaps there was another way why we've got a 2,000-year thread, and this will be very interesting because as technology grows, we don't need any carbon-14 dating stuff. We've got wide-angle X-ray, which doesn't destroy it, which is corroborated by all the other evidence. It's so unreasonable to say a middle-age date when everything else, and to put it in legal terms, the weight of the evidence doesn't show a middle-age date. And so it's wonderful to see those sciences.
Yeah, it is, and I really like the logic. And I've been a juror, and it was if it's a civil trial, it's like the preponderance of the evidence, and then whereas if it's a criminal trial, I've never been on a criminal trial, but beyond reasonable doubt, and certainly the way that you explained how all of that evidence comes in, and putting yourself in the indicted man's position and saying, well, what if I was being indicted and now being tried? Would I want to include that evidence in there or not? Very interesting. Is there anything before we close? Is there anything else that you'd like to mention?
There is so much more that I've got out of this examining it. There's so many other questions that a lawyer would naturally ask, and but I can't disclose it publicly. But there is so much there, and and it'll probably be too overwhelming in this to bring even another couple of hours of discussion here.
Well, we'll get you back on the next time in a couple of months and do that again.
Yeah. One of the exciting things, the connections that I've made recently, I've gone to a Shroud conference, which was encouraged by a fellow named Gino Iori and another guy named John Gahari. And out of that, I met in person Andrew Dalton. So I've established a connection there, and hopefully between Andrew and myself, we can get another pathway opened. But you've got to thank all the people that open the doors, and you are another person where I can share this. But if we can get people using common sense again, get rid of the clutterances. I mean, one of my experiences about 15 years ago with the government departments, and we're lucky we had a senator who was a lawyer who sent them back. They come across and said, oh, there's absolutely no evidence for what's happening. And then he, being a barrister, which I don't know if you use that term in the USA, but that's a specialist lawyer who argues in court. He said, you go back and give us it all. So what instead of giving a nice simple reply, they camouflaged it. Instead of having one issue there, significant, which was asked about, they made a huge list, 20, 30 different things of, hold on, and we've got it camouflaged. So you've got to sort through all this other superfluous information to get to the fact. And that's what has happened here. It's been camouflaged.
Yeah.
What does an ordinary person do when someone says it's a painting and you've got the media all around the world saying Leonardo painted? That's not fair.
Yeah, no, I know, and to your point about the obfuscation of the obvious, that's definitely also part of the press and also part of the naysayers, and
Yeah,
unfortunately there are the court of public opinion. I don't know if you could call it that because there's clearly some that are so biased. They're only going to present an article or a proofs on this side, and they're not going to present the proofs on the other side. And unfortunately, to get both sides, even if they presented both sides in a reasonable way, I think that would be a huge plus for the Shroud authenticists as opposed to the Shroud medievalists.
yeah, I think you're right, and that's what I'm trying to do with putting it
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
sense in the
yeah,
court of science. How do you look at this evidence? We don't want to be in Disneyland having all these fantasy things and fun that way, but we want to come to the truth, and it's so important because um, we've got 2.4 billion Christians loving Jesus. We
yeah,
have 2 billion Muslims loving Jesus as a prophet, and we've got a billion Hindus loving Jesus as a God. So this is so important to the world and to the theological science that's out there. And just to quote Thomas Aquinas, theology is the queen of the sciences. Although you're going to get a lot of people saying that's not scientific, it is. Um, and because with that sort of following, we know it's a fact that there is a Jesus who has something to do with God. And yeah, so it's
yeah.
important. Yeah.
Yep, it really is important, and the Shroud conference that you had in Australia a month or so ago, and then the one that we just had in the U.S. That dissemination. There's kind of three things that are kind of dimensions of value going on. One of them is that it really energizes all of us Shroud people, Shroud friendly people, and Shroud believers to go out and evangelize and tell people about this Shroud, this wonderful cloth that Jesus and God left for us. And then it also energizes us to go off and try and get more testing, to make the Shroud available, hopefully through the new Pope, to make the Shroud available to provide more testing, to refute some of the negative things that were in the carbon 14 and develop new tests that can hopefully continue to add to the preponderance of the evidence.
Yeah, it's very important. Although the shroud itself isn't essential for my faith, there is a point where people use their brains, and it could be removing a
Yeah,
barrier for someone else who said, "Oh, there is evidence to counter all these people who are saying Jesus is a myth and God is a sky fairy." To counter the mockers, you have some people who are
yeah, yeah,
highly intelligent, highly academic, and all of a sudden they've got a shroud here to say, "Hold on, it isn't all what the accusers say. It isn't all that. Have a good
yeah,
look." And yes, there is no myth that Jesus exists. This actually proves that he did.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So it
yeah,
is an important part, especially for many people, to convert on it. But bear in mind, when you've got such a monstrous amount of in Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam that all recognise Jesus is there, the shroud isn't essential for that. But for the
mm,
technically minded, hold on, there's something that my mind can
yeah,
grasp.
yeah.
Like
Well,
Downey Thomas, if you know what I mean, he needed to put his hands in the wounds. Well,
yeah,
some people need to get their hands on this and say, aha, this is my moment. Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
exactly. It's funny. I had it was not Nora Creech. It was Nan Balfour. I interviewed her, and for people that say I have my faith, it's strong enough. And she came back with, well, Peter had strong faith. And and Jesus asked him, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And every time he said, "Yes, yes, yes, I love you." And even then, during the trial and the passion of Christ and the crucifixion, Peter denied him 3 times. And so even if we have a super strong faith, even Peter had a super strong faith, and yet he denied Jesus 3 times. And so the shroud is just one way for me to help to continue to strengthen my faith and strengthen the love that I have for, for Jesus and what he did for us.
Yeah. It actually needs less faith when you have a whole heap of knowledge. Everyone accepts the world is a globe, and it's someone coming along and saying, no, it's flat. We all know reasonably we don't have faith. We've got actual knowledge. You'd only need a tiny bit of faith.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when we've got a knowledge, a connection like a shroud, you don't need that much more faith. If you don't have some of these tangible things and you're only by yourself, you can still get faith. But it seems to me a little bit easier with this corroborative evidence going out there.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting way to put that. I really appreciate that. Will, this has been awesome. I am looking forward to another round with you and understanding some more stuff. That this juridical perspective really puts things, especially related to the carbon dating and especially related to the Darcy's memorandum. It really puts things into perspective. Is there anywhere that people can reach you if they had questions or wanted to talk with you further?
Not at this stage because I'm thinking of moving, and not only that, I've got to get through the other stuff, which is highly confidential. I've sort of hinted at that with you,
Yeah.
and if we go through there, and if Andrew Dalton and I can work as a team together on this, and I have support in Teddy Pappas as well.
Yeah.
That's one thing I'm very, very surprised that we've got lawyers from the very beginning. We had Secundo there, who actually got it, a lawyer. And one of the huge turning points was when Tristan sent in the Freedom of Information application, and we got all this stuff finally after 27 years. So now I'm hoping we've reached another turning point by introducing common sense through juridical science. We sort out this big pile of evidence, and the only evidence that is reliable is that it came from the much earlier than the Middle Ages. So we're getting there, and now we've got a means to find out what reasonableness is. So us lawyers are doing our bit there. There's quite a few in there, but with Mark Antonucci and Teddy Pappas, and I don't know how many lawyers are involved.
Yeah, Mark Antonacci.
Yeah.
So there's quite a few. Well, thank you again, Will. Really appreciate it. And for the audience, definitely please stay tuned for many other videos and podcasts in this series on the backstory of the Shroud of Turin. Will, again, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you too. Thank you very much.